In today's episode, I'm joined by Josh Johnson. Josh is the host of Compendium, a history collection, which is a history podcast covering a variety of topics, currently doing a fantastic series on the Vietnam War. He's also known as Josh Reads Books on social media, where he has a huge following, talking about books and history and fantasy on platforms like TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, etc. This episode is actually half of a conversation that we had together on the process and theory involved in history podcasting. We bounce around a little bit, and I'll give an overview of the topics we discuss on this podcast here in a second. But in general, we talk about historical theory, morality, and narrative here on this podcast, and then more of the process of history and history podcasting on the Compendium podcast. So listen to this one and then head over to Compendium to get the rest of the conversation. As you'll see, the topics for this podcast today are wide-ranging and include the origins of reflecting history and Compendium, some meta thoughts on storytelling, creativity, and how we put podcasts together, questions of authority and expertise in history and history podcasting, how we view the role of history podcaster versus the role of historian, narrative history versus structural and thematic history, historiography, how historical narratives arise and persist, historical relativism, the standard that any history podcaster should aspire to. We talk about the Vietnam War, how morality should be understood in history generally, and how morality specifically in the Vietnam War should be understood, the connection between fantasy and history, and we also have some general thoughts on books and the world of fantasy and science fiction, specifically online, on BookTok, Instagram, and other platforms. I really enjoyed this one, and I think you will too. If you like this podcast, I think you'll enjoy Compendium as well. So check out that podcast and hope you enjoy the episode. Thanks, as always, for listening.
We've been talking in the Instagram DMs for a few weeks now, and I think we were talking about this before we hit record, but you and I sort of have some of the same interests, which I will be totally honest with you, and my wife would attest to this. I can't find anybody else that has the same interests that overlap with like the history and, sci-fi fantasy. Those worlds don't tend to collide the way that they have for me in somebody else. So I'm so excited to talk to you. I'm so excited to pick your brain and just have a nice little chat here.
Yeah, I mean, we were saying earlier, we were both amazed that there's another one out there that can kind of bounce around, to history and fantasy and sci-fi and all those things. But, a big part of my podcast, at least, and even in listening to yours for just a few weeks now, is I think there is a deeper connection than most people think between fantasy and history, fiction and history, and a lot of some of the stuff that I do on my podcast kind of delves into the narratives of history, right? And how the story gets told matters almost as much as what is told in the history, and I tend to focus on that stuff, and and that's something that interests me, and so I think it naturally leads to being interested in all those different topics you mentioned.
What was the catalyst for starting a podcast? You mentioned that you've been doing it now for over 9 years, which mad props. That's impressive. I think not just to be doing the show, because I told you this earlier, history podcasters get that doing a podcast like this, it's kind of a labor of love. You don't really do it because you expect it to blow up or make you money or anything. You do it because you just really enjoy it. And you've been doing it for almost a decade, which is really impressive just by itself. But how did it start? and then where you are now, like how has it changed as you sort of figured out what a reflecting history show looks like?
Well, that's a big question. I think it was when I started, it was probably 2015. So, as you, I'm sure, can attest to, the podcast doesn't just start when you release the first episode. There's, for me at least, there was at least a year of kind of like thinking, hey, could I do this? How would I do this? And, back then it wasn't, the podcast scene was alive and well and cooking, but it wasn't like it is now where, if you wanted to look up, hey, how do I start a podcast? You just press, hey, how do I start a podcast on ChatGPT, and it tells you what to do. But yeah, so it was feeling like I had developed some historical knowledge over the years, and I felt like I wanted to share. I think a big part of it was, honestly, I would be reading these books and I would forget what I read like 2 or 3 weeks later, and I'd be like, what am I doing? Like, I'm reading these books and I can't even tell you what I read about. I was like, hey, maybe I just use this podcast as a way to kind of, create a external memory card for myself, and, just have something I can go back to and kind of reference. And I think that was a big part of it. And probably the last part, honestly, was just listening to great podcasts and being like, hey, I want to do that.
Yeah.
In the same way, like I used to watch, Michael Jordan in the playoffs go off, against the Pacers in Game 7 or whatever, and okay, I'm going to pick up the ball, go in the driveway, and pretend I'm Jordan.
Right.
Not that I'm anywhere close to the Jordan of podcasting, but yeah, you see something cool and you want to do it. I think it's natural, but
I think that's how a lot of people start. They'll hear there's 3 or 4 of them that people will hear and they're like, I can do that. And then they realize that it's way harder than just I can do that. And it's not just one thing. It's a lot of different things. It's like there's the audio part of it, but there's the research part of it, and then there's the storytelling part of it. And you kind of have to bring a bunch of different things together. Like, for example, if you write a book, obviously you have to be able to tell a story, and you obviously have to be able to research. But like, you don't have to be, a voice behind the mic. Like, you don't have to present it, I guess, in a way. But it's a different medium. So I don't know. It's a lot of different things. It's really fun though.
yeah, and I think you said it where it's, hey, I can do that, and then you realize very quickly, oh, I can't do that. Like, I'm not Dan Carlin. I'm not
Right.
Mike Duncan. Like, I can't do that. I'm not those guys. And then as you figure that out and try to be open-minded about your strengths and weaknesses, you can figure out, okay, maybe I can't do that, but I can do this. And
Yeah.
kind of develop your own thing. How did Compendium kind of arise? I mean, obviously you have the YouTube channel and the big
Yeah,
following on Instagram and all that stuff.
It was I was listening to Dan Carlin, and I was like, I can do that because it's simple, but it's not simple. It's like you're just listening to a guy talk in your ear for 5 hours, and that doesn't sound all that hard until you sit down and try and do it, and then you realize, okay, this is a little bit more difficult than I thought. So I was doing the Instagram and TikTok stuff about books, and it was just like fantasy books. And it was like a few different things that came together. There was I was listening to different history podcasts, and I just was interested in podcasts. I had done several other ones before I started this one. This is like the 3rd podcast I've done. So I kind of understood the like podcasting part of it a little bit. So there wasn't a ton of learning curve there. And then it was listening to Carlin being like, oh, I could do that. And then I read a book. I read The Last Viking by Don Hallway. And that sent me down like a spiral into just like all the stuff that happens to get to the Battle of Hastings. And then that was the 1066 show, and I recorded it. I recorded one version of it, and then I let it sit on my computer for a year. And it was pretty different than the version that ended up going out last year. But like it was recorded in like 2 weeks, and it was done, and it was like 3 hours. It was like a 3 hour thing. But I didn't think it was all that good. And so, but there was like I don't know, like I got obsessed with it. Like I just couldn't stop thinking about it. Like I was always thinking about it. And so I just sort of like let it sit on the computer, and I was like, if I still care about this in 6 months, maybe we'll have something. But I think I was just scared of, like, if you try and tell, if you try and do narrative history, there's a lot more to it than just, hey, I think this story's cool. Like, you have to do the work and you have to research it. And I think, a little bit nervous that I wasn't even qualified to do it. Like, I could do the podcasting part, but can I do the historian part? And I didn't think I could do that, and so I just let it sit. But like 6 months went by, and I couldn't stop thinking about it. And so then I came back to it, and I redid it. And then that turned into the 1066 show. And then I jumped before I looked, and then I just started doing podcasting about Vietnam. And then I just finished the final episode, and that's going to go out here pretty soon. So there we go.
Yeah, I mean, I think there is this ebb and flow of any creative pursuit, right? And it's not just podcasting, I would think, but the type of podcast that we do is not, hey, let's call my buddy up and let's
just chat
and talk about, whatever, which is very successful for a lot of people. And I listen to a ton of those podcasts, and that's awesome. But I think what you said is true, where there's an element of, there is a full-time thing where you have to be kind of in the zone and thinking behind the scenes. I don't know if you do this, but I have like my notes app all the time, and whenever I get an idea, like boom, it goes in the notes app.
Exact same. Yeah.
Those ideas tend to happen, at 11:30 at night when I put my head down for 6 minutes and I'm drifting off to sleep, and it's
all
like,
over the place.
Yeah.
And I have multiple notes. It's not just one. It's like
yeah.
45 different ones.
Yeah. And then it gets into, reading multiple books at the same time and trying to keep things straight. And then you kind of have too much information and trying to cull it down. And there is that ebb and flow where I think if you let yourself get too down in that ebb and flow, it can be, kind of a strangely weird place to be, like, making something creative that you're worried isn't going to be good, or there's self-doubt that can creep in. And if you get too worried about the audience, I think that can be an issue. I try not to, in a weird way, like I try not to think like, hey, are people going to like this or not? And one of the things I've found is that what I think is good is not necessarily what other people think is good. And what I think sucks, other people sometimes love. Like, for example, I did this episode a long time ago. I think it was called like Chance, Luck, and Randomness in History. And I kind of analyzed like, free will and like determinism and how, those factors and how luck plays into decision making in history. And I was confused recording the episode. I was so confused. It was the first episode I ever scripted. Like, I never script an episode. Recently I've done one or two scripted ones if I feel like it's too complicated to trust myself to record it well. But 98% of my thing is not scripted. But that one was so complicated, and I had it at the end, and I recorded it, edited it down, listened to it. It's like, man, this is trash. And I was like, do I put this out? I was like, well, like crap, I got nothing else to put out. Like I've been doing this every 3 weeks for a couple of years. Like I got to put it out. And then I put it out, and like that's probably the episode people reach out to me most about. Like, hey, like
Really?
I heard about this, listen to this random thing. Like, thank you. Like, so there you go.
That's awesome. Yeah, I don't know if you get to this. I would imagine you probably do. But I get to a point where I don't know if it's good at all anymore every single time I release. And I will usually listen back to them a couple of times, and I just try and cut out like the obvious mistakes. But then once you're getting into like, am I talking about this event the right way? Is there some context that I'm missing that would change how I feel about it? Some of that, like that's the point where I'm at now with part 5, where it hasn't been released yet, but it's done. All like the dumb mistakes are out of there, and now it's just like, okay, am I thinking about these events the right way? Did I miss anything? Do I need to go read another book? Like, is it like if a historian would just come across this, would they be like, oh, this is garbage? Or would they be like, oh yeah, that's mostly it? I will take, oh yeah, that's mostly it. But if it's like, oh yeah, dude, you're way off, I think I would be, that would be frustrating. But like, I never know. I never know if I've got a good show.
But I think that right there is what makes it good, because if a historian came and emailed you and said, hey man, this sucks, and here's everything you got wrong. And then you looked at that and, you kind of said, okay, let me look into this. And then you look into it and it turns out you were wrong about something. Like for me, I would change my thing, or I would, I'm not going to like delete an episode, but I might put out another episode where I kind of go over, some of the different perspectives and, and, talk about that. And I think I can sense that in your podcast, where you have some humility and some of that open-mindedness, and there's a difference between you telling someone, hey, this is how it was, versus, hey, this historian said this historian said this, here's my measured takeaway. And I think that builds trust with an audience, I would hope, because that's how the people that I respect go about, their teachings.
Yeah. Even still, I have gotten some hate mail, and I think I felt pretty good about it when I did get some hate mail, because I was like, okay, it has reached enough people that there's people out there that hate it. And like, okay, good. We've gotten to a point where there are enough people.
Vietnam is
it's
tough,
divisive.
I think. It's like you said, that's one where there's so much discussion, so many sources, so much heated debate. Unfortunately, I think that's part of the gig, is, as someone who's putting something out for people to consume publicly, like that's part of the thing. But
yeah, I mean, if I were to go do a show on Persian kings, there's not a soul alive who would probably have something bad to say, unless it was like one of the 5 or 6 like experts, professors emeritus somewhere. Yeah, they might have a problem with it, but like nobody else is gonna have a problem with it. But when you're doing something that's got,
nobody's coming in with a hot take on the defenestration of Prague.
No.
There's a couple of hot topics.
No, I mean, you go back to World War II and you might have the Winston Churchill debates. There's a time horizon with some of these debates where if you go back far enough, nobody cares.
Yeah, no, and I think I got more of this early in my podcast, but I did get a decent amount of, I wouldn't call it hate mail, but I would call it people who thought I did something wrong, or thought I covered something the wrong way, or just wanted to be critical of what I was doing. And I think, as long as you're doing that in good faith, I would always try to respond and understand that perspective. And sometimes those people ended up I think being people who still listen to the podcast,
Yeah.
in a weird way.
No, I mean, I think I've realized or maybe come to grips with the fact that sort of thing is going to happen at some point. Like regardless of how well you research the thing you're talking about, there's going to be something, and it might be minor. It might not be a major thing. I mean, God forbid, it might be a major thing. But like you never know. There's going to come a point where there's going to be something wrong. And I've even noticed, like in some of the earlier Vietnam episodes, and I was going based off one of the sources, but I realized one of the sources was wrong, because it was using kind of an outdated idea about a person. And again, it's tough because it's Vietnam, and like, you know, some of those policymakers in North Vietnam, like nobody knew that they were doing anything or as heavily involved as they ended up being until, 10, 15 years ago. So it's kind of like new information tacked onto old information, but some of the sources are just way, way off. And I'm going based on those sources saying like, here's, saying so-and-so says this, but conveying to the audience, hey, this happened, didn't happen.
Yeah.
But because sources are wrong. And so nobody has, sent an email been like, hey, that's wrong. But I kind of know like, yeah, such and such person writing about this thing was wrong. I quoted them. Hopefully nobody's too mad about it.
I'll be honest, I considered very briefly, many years ago, doing a Vietnam centered series of podcasts, and I chickened out. Yeah, like I would have to have an angle to come at it from, and I couldn't find that angle. I think doing what you're doing is a noble pursuit, and it's super interesting. But kind of coming at it from that narrative perspective of, here's the story of the Vietnam War is a huge undertaking, and I commend you for going for it.
Well, I'll be honest. I started working on it before I realized what I had gotten myself into. And I think it was after I released the second episode that I had a moment where I was like, I'm never going to finish this. Like, I'm going to be working on this for the next 5 years, and it's going to be terrible. And I think I have a moment for each episode, probably halfway through the recording process, where I'm like, I don't know how this is going to end up being an episode. Like, I don't know. I might be an hour and a half in, and I record it linearly, and then I just have what I have at the end of it. But I might be an hour and a half in, and I'm like, I honestly don't know where this is going. I cut out big stuff. Like, you'll notice, going back to it, there's big things that didn't even make the cut that probably would make the cut if I just was like, yeah, let's make it a 20-hour show instead of, 16 hours or whatever it ends up being. But I don't know. Hopefully it's like, yeah, well, in the service of the narrative, it's fine. But, we'll see.
Well, one thing I wanted to talk to you about kind of relates to this, and I think a certain segment of people in the modern day are under the impression that history as a discipline or as a subject kind of has one standard narrative. And, you might think of it like this is the establishment narrative of, whatever this topic is, World War II or Vietnam. And I think the conversation we're just having shows that, for me at least, that's couldn't be further from the truth, where in the historical community, there is crazy amounts of disagreement about almost every topic. And all of that debate and iron sharpening iron is something that interests me personally. And, hopefully the audience of my podcast, and I believe they have this, and they're smart and, I think interested in this way that not only are you telling the history, but you're telling the history of the history, and why different perspectives are the way they are, and how the narratives got going. And
Yeah.
so I just thought what you said there is a nice kind of way to show that there's more to the historical landscape than just one kind of standard thing. And does that make any sense?
Absolutely. That's like, I think that's the part of this that I have grown to love so much is it's not math. There's not one answer.
Mm.
And I think a lot of people approach history as in events happened a certain way, and that's how they should be told. And I think the further back you go in history, the more you have to recognize that you're not necessarily just learning a set of dates and events, you're learning culture and people and how things change, and how people believing different things changes their reality in a certain way, which sounds like a fantasy novel. But like if a Norse person in the 900s believe that spirits are real and they act on that, they're real. Like they have real effects in the real world. And you and I now can look back and say, yeah, forest nymphs are not real. They're fake. But if somebody way back when was acting on that knowledge and changing how they lived their life based on that knowledge, it did have real world effects, and it needs to be involved in the story. There's a story in Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla where he's writing about Harold Hardrada, and he's in prison in Constantinople. And while he's in prison, he battles a large snake. And he obviously didn't battle a large snake, but it's become part of Harold's story to the point that you can't tell the story of Harold Hardrada without mentioning the fact that, oh yeah, while he was in a dungeon, he fought a huge snake. It's one of those things where like you're reading it and you kind of have to chuckle a little bit and just be like, oh, okay. And it's got like an Arthurian legend sort of a thing to it. But if it's been told and layered upon itself so often and so much over, hundreds of years, it becomes the story. And so in Harold Hardrada's story, you have factual elements like he fought and died at the Battle of Stamford Bridge mixed in with the fact that he apparently fought a giant serpent in Constantinople when he was a Varangian guard. So history has a lot of different elements to it. And even, when you get into modern stuff, like with the Vietnam War, there's myths about the Vietnam War as well and how it's reported. And if you're to fast forward 100, 200 years from now, I think the narrative that people will tell themselves about the Vietnam War is going to be very, very different than what actually happened. And that's like history just kind of happens that way. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just kind of a thing. And I think when you get to explore some of those different nuances and cool stories, like you have great narrative. It's just that you have to recognize and realize like history is not just a set of dates and events. It's much more than that.
It reminds me a little bit of the way that some people view religion, right? Where I think if you asked most people, do you actually believe that the earth was flooded and then 40 days later, somebody pulled the plug on the drain and the water went somewhere else to another planet or something. And, the 40 types of animals, I don't know, whatever the story was, I think most people would say, hey, that probably didn't happen, right? But they might say the collection of archetypes and stories and the meaning behind those stories over the course of years have developed into something that kind of has taken on a life of its own. And, and obviously religion is a lot more complicated than that, but this idea of archetypes and storytelling and narratives is part of history too. And if you ignore that, like you were saying there, I think you're making a big mistake.
Yeah, I talked to Don Holloway, who wrote that book, The Last Viking, and it's the story of Harold Hardrada, and he's got that snake story in there. And I asked him, like, you and I sitting here now, like, we know he didn't fight a snake. Like, why are we including that in a history? Because you sort of have a connotation. If you're writing a history, it's definitive, it's, academic, and it's like there's standards that are associated with something like that when you kind of say, like, I'm writing a history of Harold Hardrada. And he was like, it's become history because of how so many people told the story at campfires for 900 years. And it may not be true, but it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. And I think there's something that's really cool about that. If you're a math person, it might not be for you, because like there's going to be that frustrating rub of like, I know it didn't happen, but everybody says that it's part of the story and it's not. But like, I mean, are you going to take it out? Are you going to remove this shared history that people have had for hundreds of years because you don't think something happened? Like, do you feel like you have earned the right to do that? What makes you special enough that you can take it out? And it's a cultural thing. It's more than just, a binary. It's people believe this, and, it's not always so, silly as maybe a snake. It might be more subtle than that. It might be that I was reading a myth today that in the 900s that a lot of people believed that there was a female pope. And there's like no factual basis, at least according to that article, there was no factual basis to believe that. And it most certainly didn't happen, but like people believed it. And, what do you do with that? Do you disprove it, or do you say, well, people believed it and you can do with that what you will?
So do you think that there potentially could be an issue with what we've kind of been outlining there, this idea of what people believed at the time and not dismissing that? Do you think that there could be an issue where at some point someone might say that kind of eventually devolves into some form of like relativism, where he says this, I say this, she says that, how do we know what's true? And maybe someone that's critical of the history podcast in general might say, any history podcast in general might say, how do you actually know any of this happened if you're saying that when the Aztec Empire collapsed, all of our information came from the Spanish and the Spanish are biased? How do we know what they're saying, matters? And how do we scale the accuracy of what they're saying, and what does it even mean to be accurate? I'll throw that giant question of philosophy at you to solve here.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it somewhat varies. Certain narratives, I think, lend themselves more to historicity than others do. Some of them lend more to like a psychological, sort of a humanistic approach. And I think the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. I'm not sure that there is a hard and fast, here's what you do. I think you have to almost take it case by case. For example, humans shape a lot of the history that's written down, and then historians go back and look at the history that's written down and try to rebuild a narrative based on it. But when humans are shaping that history, that doesn't necessarily mean they're telling you the facts as they actually happened. They're telling you the facts as they want you to think they actually happened. And like in the Norman Conquest, almost all of our sources about the Norman Conquest are Norman. They're not Anglo-Saxon. So you don't really get, outside of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, you don't have a ton of sourcing from an Anglo-Saxon perspective for how things go. But you have Odo of Bayeux, you've got William's different chroniclers, there's like 4 or 5 of them. And then you have later chroniclers that are working based off Norman sources and sort of expanding upon what the Normans wrote. So their narrative leans pro-Norman, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's exactly how it happened. It just means that's the history we've got. And, difference like World War II, I think there's a lot of narratives about the modern world that are built upon the bedrock of World War II, but it's more recent. And I think you can work with a little bit more of a concrete narrative. The Vietnam War is the same way. You can work with a more concrete narrative. But even still, I think I read somewhere that somebody says a lot of our foundational myths are built on World War II and the Vietnam War. And I think in some ways that's true. But also in some other ways, you notice a lot of people forgetting what the facts were and acting on that lack of information or the lack of impact that information should have had.
Mm.
And so it is somewhat of a case-by-case sort of a thing. I think if you're interested in the stories, you read the sources that we've got, and then you interrogate them and you say, why might they say it this way? And, if there's conflict of interest, which frankly is often, you just sort of have to factor that in and say, well, they might not be super trustworthy on this aspect of it, but they might be really trustworthy in this other aspect of it. I was reading Arian the other day, and he's got maybe the definitive narrative of Alexander the Great's campaign of Persia, or, not definitive, but maybe one of the better ones. But he's got bias, and you sort of have to factor that in of he's a fan. He's writing it many years later as a fan. And so you're not getting a super pro-Persia narrative there. And you just kind of have to factor that in. It's like, well, we don't have a lot of great Persian sourcing for this, but we have really good Greek sourcing. And you just sort of take it for what it is. And you try and read between the lines where you can. But, in a lot of cases, it just sort of is what it is.
There's an awesome short story that sort of gets at this topic. It's called The Man Who Ended History by Ken Liu. Have you ever read it?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's like, I did a podcast on this a while ago, but it's kind of like, imagine you could go back in history basically with a video camera and you could get the exact perfect accuracy of the event that happened. How would that change the study of history? And it's it's an awesome short story, and and there's other things going on, but in some ways it would change things dramatically forever, but in other ways it wouldn't change that much at all, because people would still be debating exactly what you said. They would be taking the modern day and using that as a lens to view the past, and you would end up getting the same debates over narratives that you have in the historical community. So,
yeah, I mean, I was thinking the other day, like there is a major war happening between Ukraine and Russia right now, and how much concrete factual information do you and I have about that war that's happening in an age with great video cameras, with the ability to capture stuff? And, I don't know if you have researched it a ton and maybe just are up on it better than I am. I don't know a whole lot about what's happening over in Ukraine. And you get like the overarching narratives, but that's history. Like, people in 50 years are going to be writing books about this war in Ukraine, but the overarching narrative is going to have so many holes in it. And we just have like this pretty generic Russia versus Ukraine sort of a thing, and there's connotations there, but in terms of like what's actually happening, unless you're there, it's very, very difficult to actually get to the facts. And I think history's just sort of always been that way.
I guess so. Given all of the garbage we've been throwing into the muddy pile that is history here, how do you view your role as the podcaster? And we had said we wanted to talk about this, but you had mentioned imposter syndrome earlier. I don't remember if that was going to end up in the recording or not, but do you feel as if you being the authority when presenting your podcast is something that is important? Do you view yourself as an enthusiast? What's the difference between a historian and a podcaster? So I'd be curious to get your take.
It's going to be a fluid answer because I have incredible imposter syndrome. I don't know what would like make that go away. I don't know if it ever would, even if I became incredibly knowledgeable about a subject. I feel like there's always going to be somebody in a place of power that could tear it down. I talked to Mike Cole, who's written several books. You could consider him a historian. Like, he has published works of history in my book that makes you a historian. And he wrote a book called The Bronze Lie, where he pointed out this narrative that, like, Spartans weren't as awesome as you think they were. And the Bronze Lie is that they were awesome. And the Bronze Lie generates from one of the most, like, maybe the preeminent Spartan historian in the world right now, a guy named Paul Cartledge, who's written excellent books. He is an extremely venerated historian. When he speaks, people listen. Well, Mike Cole writes this book that debunks a lot of the things that Cartledge says about Spartans, and he backs it up. Like, the work, it's not just, a shot thrown on Twitter. Like, there's work there. There's history being done. And Cartledge came after him. And he said, when I was talking to him, that was like hugely formative for him, but also in a good way, because he realized that even though Cartledge could come after him, he couldn't debunk his work. And so I took several things from that. One, there's always somebody around the corner, and you're not making the show to satisfy everyone. You're not writing the book if that's what you're doing, to satisfy everyone. There's a process, and there's work that goes into it. And I think if you do the work effectively, it doesn't matter if you're not like a credentialed historian. Regular folks can do historical work if they do the work. And I think that's the part that you kind of default to, like, is the thing that you make good? And if the thing you make is good, somebody might have a problem with it, and, like, that's fine. But I think if the work is good, it kind of, like, I think you need to be able to take some self-satisfaction away from that. And that's harder said than done. Because, like, tackling Vietnam, it's a huge subject. And I'm sure I've misrepresented some things. And, like I said, there's a couple things that I think I probably got wrong in the process. But, I feel like I've done good work. I feel like I have researched, and for this type of story I was trying to tell, I feel like I've, developed a narrative throughout, the process that is good, and I think it's good work. So, I don't know. I don't know how you feel about it. I think
it's a tough one.
It's so tough. And two, like, if you're going to publish a book, I feel like there's almost another, it's almost like a related but somewhat different conversation. Like, the bar is a little bit higher maybe. I don't know that the bar is as high if you're making a podcast. I think people will accept a little bit less, and that's not because people are, accepting of poor history narrative, but that they just don't expect you to be like the preeminent voice on the thing you're talking about. I think people are willing to just, like, have a conversation about this thing. And if you know more than they do about it, that kind of puts you at a place where you can do that. But even still, like there's kind of like a weird gray area where, you want to know as much as you can, but also you got to release stuff. So you can't just spend 3 years researching something. Like, you got to get something out every month or two, and at the end of the day, there's like a soft deadline in there.
Yeah, I think I've thought about this a lot, and I think we're just podcasters. Like, I think that's the label that you give us, and I don't think that we're historians.
Yeah.
I don't think that, one of the things that I've come away with doing my podcast and even having the opportunity to interview a few historians on my podcast, what they do is really time consuming and intensive. And I mean, you could pull one of those Richard J. Evans World War II books off my shelf right now, and just reading the footnotes or the bibliography of that book would literally be a 3-hour podcast, like just reading the footnotes.
There's nothing more humbling than reading the bibliography of like a really big history book, and it's like 15 pages, tiny font of just sources, and you're like, oh,
yeah,
okay.
But I don't think we have to be necessarily historians to do what we do, and I think we have an awesome opportunity, like you said, where if we do it good and if we execute it and if we are able to make a connection with people, I think the best way to think about it is, almost like being a teacher or being, like a low-level professor, right? Where you're building relationships with people, you are, presenting hopefully something interesting and historical and new for them. And, hopefully you're using that to do some good in the world, right? And maybe show people, hey, like, here's different perspectives on this topic, and here's how trends and forces and systems can impact you in your life, right? And here's how critical thinking matters. And, here's the difference between living an examined life, right, and thinking about these things, which I think is step one, versus not doing those things. And to me, if that's my goal, then I'm not super worried, how many downloads I have, or, am I in the same class as this podcaster or this historian, or, so for me, I usually try to keep that in mind if I ever have that kind of feeling of imposter syndrome, or, a lack of expertise or anything like that would kind of prevent me from keeping going with this thing.
Yeah, there's I'm trying to find a quote here. There's a French historian named Marc Bloch who wrote a book where I think it's called Writing History, or maybe it's Life in History, or something like that. It's essentially a historian writing a book about the craft of being a historian. And he's got a quote in the book where he says, "Tell me what you know, but also how you know it."
Mm-hmm.
And it's referring to, like, if he's having a conversation with a student or another historian, it's tell me what the facts are, but it's tell me also how you arrived at those facts. And I think if you could, like, dumb down the process, it's finding the facts and then figuring out how you arrived at those facts. And I think you're right.
And then communicating them, I think, is
right.
Some people can do those first two things, and then the communication, for maybe a bunch of different reasons, would fall apart.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Adding in that extra element of, you have a really complicated topic and you just can't convey it. Like, that is its own extra can of worms. This is just the like step 1, step 2. There's a whole step 3 and 4 maybe that's in addition to.
But yeah, I interrupted you. Sorry, but keep going.
No. I mean, I think, like I said, podcasters are not held to the same standard. but I do think there needs to be a standard. And I think you did touch on this. I don't know exactly, like, I don't know if you can put into words specifically what that standard is of like historicity and, and fact. And I think it's approach. And I'm curious your take on this. I think that if you have a respect for history and like an appreciation of it, and maybe even a love for it, if you want to go that far, you will attempt to tell the narrative the correct way. That doesn't mean that you'll get everything right. It doesn't mean that you won't potentially make some mistakes. But I think if you approach it with the correct posture, that probably covers up a lot of sins.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. There's a standard, right? And I try to meet that standard, right? And if the podcast sucks, then it sucks. But like, it's not going to suck because I didn't put a ton of thought into it and it wasn't well researched. And, there will never be a moment where I just like, all right, guys, I'm going to hit record and, see
we'll
what
see
happens.
what we get.
Yeah. Like, and hey, maybe, you experiment with things and maybe something like that becomes an interesting way to do things. But, I'm trying to get at what you're saying there, where you have a respect for the subject, you have a respect for the topic. When you're dealing with history, I think it's interesting to me because you're dealing with people, right? They're not alive anymore, but you would want someone to tell your story with a respect to it, right? And you would not want to be dismissed historically for whatever reason, and you would want the person telling that story to understand you and hopefully try to do you justice, right? So yeah. I try to keep that in mind.
Yeah, and I think you can tell, and maybe it's just in like format and medium and approach, but I think you can somewhat tell when somebody cares about what they're doing. And it comes across in the details. It comes across in the approach. It comes across in, learning the actual like podcasting part of it, going from, there's an audio element here. I think if you really care, it extends even into that. Like there's the historical process, there's the processing process, there's the, recording process. Like, and there's a Jerry Seinfeld quote, and I think he's talking to like Harvard Business Review or something, and he's talking about creative process, and I think they were asking him like, maybe it was he had the opportunity to have a writer's room do another season of Seinfeld or something instead of just him or something like that. Like there was an opportunity to do something an easier way than he had been doing it, and he turned it down. And they were baffled because there was a significant amount of money to be made if he would have done it the easy way. And he said it wouldn't have been good because that thing was created the hard way. And if I would have done it the easy way, it wouldn't have been any good because I would not have been in it. And I think there's that part of it where like anytime you're doing something creative, if you are in it and you're putting part of you in it, it really can't suck. Maybe there's parts that can be like somewhat incorrect, and you kind of correct those as you come across the corrections, but it really can't suck all that bad.
Yeah. All right, so I wanted to ask you, when you're making these podcasts, what is your approach to morality? So I'll kind of introduce my sort of background here, is that I think a lot of people in sort of the general population sort of have this view of history that somewhere along the line, maybe 1989 or, somewhere around there, humans developed morality. And before that time, we had never thought about right and wrong. And, you'll talk about, slavery or something, the Middle Passage, and you'll hear people say, like, hey, man, you're applying modern standards of morality to an ancient world, and that's not how history is done. But the problem, I think, is that people during that time had morality and they thought about right and wrong. And you're not applying the standards of our time to today. You're trying to look at what was the morality of their time and go from there. And I think that is like a crucial but important distinction that a lot of people miss. So my question to you, I guess, is like, first of all, what are your thoughts on that? And then especially you making this podcast on the Vietnam War, which is like the most morally gray, event of, modern times, you could argue.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up slavery, which is, I think, like the quintessential example of when you're applying modern morals to the past, because I think the line that a lot of people use, and I've used this, is you can't really judge people in the past outside of how other people in their time, would have judged them. So, like, I'll use the Harold Hardrada example. He was like a tyrant of a king, and yet he lived in a time when the things that he did were like very normal for kings. But if Donald Trump were to start acting like Harold Hardrada, we would have major, major geopolitical issues because you just can't act like that. You can't just go kill people because you feel like it. Like Clovis, I think it's the Merovingian king. He had a reputation where he would, if a guy pissed him off multiple times, he just like would axe him to death because he felt like it. And if you were to look at that with a modern lens, you would say, oh, that guy was terrible. And yet it was like a normal, and maybe it was a bit dialed up for his time. Maybe he was a bit more aggressive than the average person in his time, but it wasn't outlandish. He was a king. He could do what he wanted. And there's a whole thing there. So slavery is really interesting because you have a moral struggle in their time. And I think I have seen this now. It is so odd to me, and it honestly gets me a little riled up, but it is so odd to me, the revisionism that you'll see on social media now where people try and convince you that, like, no, the Northerners hated them too, or they would have, trying to do these like weird arguments where it's like, yeah, but like Southerners weren't really all that weird or out of touch with reality for their time because the Northerners were racist too. Abolitionists were racist, even though they were fighting against slavery. And like, that is the element where you say, like Abraham Lincoln several times, he said things that if you were to apply modern morality to him then, you would say, oh, well, he was a racist. Well, that is the part where you have to parse it out and you actually have to do the historical work. He might have been racist in our time, but in his time, that was normal. Slavery was the part that was contested in his time. So then you can start to have those moral questions about slavery because in their time, there was a moral struggle about that. Was there a moral struggle about something that we have already established now? No. And that's where you have to be careful about applying modern morality to the past. Vietnam's really interesting because I'm convinced there's no good guys in this story. I'm convinced it is just like a Debbie Downer all the way around. And it's for different it's like it's failure, and I love stories that are just like studies in failure. I love kind of just the nihilistic sort of you leave with the best intentions, and despite your best intentions, it still ends up being terrible anyway. You know, the United States is supposed to be the kind of the representative of the light, or they're supposed to be the good guys in the story, I guess. And I read a 300-page book that's literally example after example for 300 pages of U.S. soldiers murdering innocent people when they didn't have to. Not because they were caught in a situation where it was like a judgment call in a moment where they could have gone either way, and they opted towards, I'm going to protect myself kind of a thing. It was not, it's 300 pages of not that kind of a situation. It's 300 pages of, there's somebody running, they're running, therefore I'm going to shoot them. Or just like terrible, terrible things over and over again. So like, they are not blameless. And then the North Vietnamese are equally not blameless. It just didn't get out. And so you have this story where you've got like, you've got on the U.S. side, like people made terrible decisions. It was like this institutional problem where the military was almost just like engineered to kill anybody, everybody. And so it creates situations where soldiers end up killing innocent people, and that happens. And senators and protesters back home are getting these stories, and they're sensationalized in some cases, but also in some cases they're not. They're just like, you hear about My Lai, and I mean, you don't have to sensationalize that one at all. It's bad enough by itself.
Yeah.
And there's like 15 more besides that one. So there's that. There's the North Vietnamese several times just murdered hundreds. I mean, there's probably hundreds of thousands of civilians that the North Vietnamese government murdered as well. So it's not I guess, blame for mistakes or for like just atrocities. It's like it's an equal opportunity employer. It's you can have some, and you can have some, and you can have some, and it's just a terrible thing all the way around. And I think in both cases, the Vietnamese paid for it, and the Americans paid for it. And it's one of those things where I think you can study the Vietnam War not just for the military parts, but you can study it just to try and see yourself in the mirror, because I think you will see a lot of that. You'll see a lot of modern, 2025 lessons in 1968, which is pretty incredible.
One of the sort of standard interpretations of Vietnam is that it changed the American psyche, of sort of the back home, the American citizens' viewpoint on how morality works, right? And maybe before Vietnam, there was a much more black and white Soviet, communist, bad guy, capitalist, America, good guy thing going on. And, and that's probably oversimplifying a lot of things. But my question to you is like, do you feel like that is, when you were doing this podcast, do you think Vietnam is something that fundamentally changed our society to look more at things from like a morally gray perspective as opposed to black and white?
Yeah, I think it's crazy because you can go watch newsreel clips or interviews with people during the war or right before, like regular regular people. And a lot of times they're asking them questions about, like, what should the U.S. do? What do you feel about communism? What do you feel about China, the Soviet Union? What do you feel about Vietnam? And it's crazy because the general sentiment of, I think, the regular American pre-Vietnam War is very trusting of their government, very trusting of the people around them, and firmly convinced, I don't even know the best way to put this, but like firmly convinced that they live in almost like a utopian society. And that might be putting it too kindly, but there's like an element of that. Like, America's a superpower. We can kind of do what we want, and also we're the good guys. And sort of however that manifests, it's all of those things in one. And then you go to Vietnam, and it breaks all of those myths that everybody was telling themselves. It's breaking the myths that the government's trustworthy. The war's literally started because of a lie. It's breaking the myths that the people around you are trustworthy because you have all these soldiers that are just doing unspeakable things to innocent people. And then it breaks the idea that America is as strong or capable as everybody thought they were. A lot of times, like if you read the Pentagon Papers, a lot of times the words that are used early on, like Truman and Kennedy era, are like that Vietnam is going to be a police action. You're going to go in there and you're just going to shape them up, put them in handcuffs, put them in the back of the cop car, and they're going to straighten out. They're going to start acting right. And that turns into a limited war, which should have, like, if you're going to do that and do it right, it needs to be an unlimited war, and that was never an option on the table. And so it leads to all these like decisions that the logic of all of them is fundamentally flawed. And so it breaks the military, it breaks like societal trust, and then also, oh yeah, let's throw in the civil rights movement, which is maybe the most like societally upheaving kind of a moment. And you just tack that on to the stuff already happening in Vietnam.
Yeah. One of the things you mentioned somewhere in that podcast, I don't remember which episode, but what you just said, you talk about the difference between a limited war and a total war. And maybe you could make the argument that America was kind of coming off of total war, right? With World War II.
Yeah.
Of course, Korea's in there, and that's kind of a different story. But Vietnam was a limited war, which means that you need, I think the way you put it is proportionality between the ends and the means, right? And in a total war, the ends always justify the means, because the, at least from the state's perspective, right? The state is going to try to preserve itself, and they're going to do whatever it takes to do that. But in a limited war, the ends don't justify the means, and that leads to all kinds of crazy moral dilemmas and questions over right and wrong, and kind of existential questions of what are we doing here.
Yeah, and I mean the Vietnamese are fighting a total war the whole time. They fight a total war with the French, they fight a total war with the Americans, and they win, quote unquote win, both of them. The French fight a limited war, the Americans fight a limited war. It's amazing, and I'm so glad that this worked, but it wasn't intentional from the outset. It just sort of happened this way. I'm glad that you get the French War first and then the American War in the series, because they are not talked about oftentimes together, but they're one thing. And they're so similar in so many different ways. Like the French, they're different, but the French make so many of the mistakes that the Americans end up making. And the Americans are there a lot of times and are able to observe the French making these mistakes and study them. And then they still make the same mistakes. And so it's different. I wrote an article on Substack where I begged the question, like, why on earth, once you know that a limited war is not getting it done, I don't know at what time horizon you get to a point where you're like, this isn't cutting it. But I would imagine, I mean, the war probably officially, I think Marines landed in 1965. Maybe after 68, you kind of have a moment when it's we quit or we elevate it to, if we're going to win, this needs to be a total war. And I think you're probably left with the decision where you could do either one. Spoiler alert, the United States kind of goes halfway in between the two of them, goes in the middle. I wrote an article where I was wondering, like, why'd they never invade North Vietnam? And I talked to Edwin Moise, and I asked him that question. I was like, why? Because it just seems so obvious. Like, if you're going to beat fire with fire, that seemed like the most obvious next step. And his answer was something along the lines of, it was talked about but never seriously considered. And he sort of left it at that. And so that was something I wanted to explore in the series, was like, why was that not more explored? And the conclusion I came to was because of fear of the Chinese, especially in the Soviet Union, kind of secondarily, that if you invaded North Vietnam, Chinese advisors, they were called advisors, but there was like 100,000 Chinese troops that nobody ever saw. Everybody was afraid that it turns into Korea 2.0. And by that point, Vietnam was strong enough that if you coupled them with China, like, there was zero chance. And if it was one of those things where it's like, if you give China an excuse, China didn't want to get into a ground war with the United States. They were, I think, and I'm guessing here, so I might be practicing history without a license, I have a feeling they were just as timid about getting into a ground war with the U.S. as the U.S. was with them. But, you know, geopolitics being what they are, if you invaded North Vietnam, the puppet state, China probably would have responded in kind, and so they didn't. And I did a little study of a French operation in the first Indochina War called Operation Lee, where it's this paratrooper operation, and they go for broke. They try to kill Ho Chi Minh and Giap and sort of cut off the head of the snake. And they are like 10 minutes. There's a 10-minute difference between Ho Chi Minh and Giap escaping the place where they were and French paratroopers arriving. And there's this moment when, like, they get into the hut. They're in like these little huts. It's not even a building or anything. And there's all the papers and the hot coffee that, Ho Chi Minh had on his desk. And it's like razor thin. And if they would have gotten there on time, you can imagine how things might have been different. But I basically came to the conclusion, like, they saw the French try and it didn't work. And I feel like there was probably some discussion in some of these meetings of, like, and it's so ironic because they witnessed all these mistakes the French made and repeated them, but then potentially, and again, I don't know if this is true or not, but I almost like to think that they saw that operation, because surely they studied it, and they said, yeah, we're not going to try and repeat that. So.
Yeah, I mean, you have so many interesting threads to pull on, and that's something you say a lot in the podcast, and
so many threads.
You can sense why it would be so difficult to make kind of a story in podcast form of the Vietnam War. And I think you have these dichotomies, right, where we mentioned earlier, like kind of black and white morality versus morally gray morality. You have, imperialism and the imperialistic mindset versus sort of the nationalism mindset, or the self-determining mindset. You have the limited war versus the total war. And another one that I was thinking about with Vietnam was, actually, I heard this from Sir Max Hastings in a podcast. And he was saying something, like, sometimes people say something and it articulates what you have always been thinking, but you've never been able to articulate it. And he said that military history is social history. And when you write a military history, you are really writing a book about the victims.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that I've kind of, like he said those words and that like clicked in my head. I was like, that's what I think. Because when I first started this podcast, I think I was much more on like hey, we're going to, study these big wars and the battles, and, and then as I got in, I was like, why do I care about that? Like, I want to talk about why these victims became victims and how we make sure that doesn't happen anymore,
Yeah.
And so I just thought that was cool, because I know you've cited Max Hastings a lot in your podcast.
Yeah, he's got a great book. I think in a similar way, I would agree with him. Also, there's the Clausewitz quote that everybody quotes, but he says that war is policy by another means. And so the extension of that is war is also just a study in politics. And I did not think that I would be fascinated by politics before this, but and maybe it's just because it's the events, and they are the politics themselves are just so like zany that they're inherently interesting. But this really turned into, I initially set out to like focus a lot on victims, and I think I do to some extent, but I probably could have spent so much more time. And I ended up spending a ton of time on policy, on decision making, and the politics, because yeah, it's a story about the war, but the war is not the story of the fighting. The war is really the story of the policy decisions. And when I found a book that actually went pretty deep into Hanoi's policy decisions, the whole thing was made. I was like, I have that book, and then I pair it with a few other books, and then I have the show right there, because that seemed to be the heart of it as it developed. And like the French parts had different parts to it, but it just sort of developed that way.
Well, I think I wanted to get to some of your takes on fantasy and sci-fi and some of the book stuff. So yeah, I guess my question for you is, like, first of all, how do you sort of view fantasy and sci-fi and fiction? Do you see it as kind of an extension of history, kind of the way I see it, or do you see it as a separate thing, or kind of what is your kind of general viewpoint towards it? Because I guess we were saying, like, I don't know if people will have heard what we were saying earlier before we hit record, or what's going to be on my podcast versus your podcast, but like for me, like, it makes total sense to go from a George R. R. Martin quote to analysis of Weimar Germany.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, I'm not sure. Listening to your podcast, I heard, you tossing around, Tolkien in your Vietnam analysis, like, So yeah, what are your thoughts there?
I don't know. I think I'm still toying with that. Because in part, I'm still trying to figure out exactly how I approach it. I think in a lot of ways, fantasy is an extension of history, And I think a lot of people get into history because they want more of a grounding for the fantasy. Like a lot of fantasy writers get into history, and you have like this easy land bridge between, wanting to tell and write fantasy stories and wanting to have some grounding for them. So I don't know if that's even how I got into history, but I think there's parts of it that are in there. Like
What got you into history?
I think there was,
or what got you into fantasy and sci-fi, and what got you into history, and were those separate things?
I feel like they were somewhat separate, but like I was always into fantasy. I started reading fantasy books during college, and then it just sort of developed. And after a few years of reading fantasy books, you kind of have a pretty good bedrock of books you've read. And then the history, I honestly think it started because I wanted to do a history podcast. But it had to marinate for a while because you have to start thinking differently.
Mm-hmm.
And so it marinated, and I was reading, and I tend to have an approach with history where like I don't necessarily just like pick up a book from one era and go into another one and then pick up another book and sort of just like sprinkle around and get a general view of things. I tend to go like really, really deep on one thing and sit in that for a while and then move on to another one. So it lends itself to a podcast, great. But it means that like I couldn't speak to you super educatedly about the Mongols. I've listened to Wrath of the Khans. So I've got like a little bit of that, but I haven't really researched it. But it means that the subjects that I have deep dived, I feel like I know a pretty decent amount about. But I don't know, like they might be related, but also they're somewhat separate. And I'm not really sure why that is, because I didn't really start reading history books to inform fantasy or deepen it. But like reading more history has made some fantasy just too goofy to take seriously. But it also makes like the fantasy that's really, really good, it makes it that much better. Like a Martin or a Steven Erikson or somebody that clearly understands history. They add that part in, and it just adds another layer, and it's like, oh, this is special.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Almost all the fantasy that is in like my top shelf is there's some element of like, oh, this person deeply understands human nature and historical systems and how governments work and how economies work. And like Joe Abercrombie would be a great example.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've ever read Robin Hobb, but I think she's
a little. Yeah.
Yeah,
she, at least from what I can tell, she understands human nature incredibly well.
Yeah. And those are the stories that tend to stick with me. Is like where you have a history within the story, within the fantasy. And that's like Game of Thrones. Like that's the coolest thing ever. It's like as the story's unfolding, you're also learning about the rebellions that happened before and the landings, on the wars and the dragons. And, to me, like history makes fantasy better.
Yeah.
But because it seemed like you started the book kind of social media, Instagram, YouTube stuff before you started the history stuff. So what made you want to, I have, I don't know, I have some complicated thoughts on the general nature of the kind of book talk, bookstagram thing that I myself am a part of.
Yeah.
But yeah, I guess I'm curious to hear like what your thoughts are on how that's blown up over the last couple of years and how you got into that and what your experience has been.
Yeah. I think I started it because I wanted to write a book, or publish a book. I had written books before. And I wanted to have some sort of an audience when I did. And then sort of it'll be a common theme. I started doing it and then enjoyed it and then started doing the social media thing for the love of the thing and the community that kind of came along with it. And I think that community part of it has been really rewarding, more than even just like numbers or whatever. But all that being said, you would be like removing a huge part of this if you also didn't mention the fact that like it's helped the history podcast quite a bit getting off the ground. So like I didn't really have goals of starting a history podcast. But I just sort of deep dived 1066. It was weird. Like I I would not recommend this process to anyone, because I feel like, and this is probably where some of the imposter syndrome part comes in, like I haven't been reading history books for 15 years. I've been reading history books for like 5 years. And maybe that's why I don't really sprinkle around, because I feel like you can't get a great understanding of something by reading one book. You get a great understanding reading 5 to 10 and like analyzing them. And I listen to history podcasts for a long time, since college. And I think that part of it helps inform, at least it acts like a secondary source, sort of shaping the narrative in your head and giving it some bones. But yeah, I really, and this is going to be a theme probably with Compendium for forever. Like I jump and then I look. And so
Yeah.
I started the podcast really without processing what all it meant. I started the TikTok without processing all that would mean. And then I just sort of found ways to kind of keep it rolling and reprioritize as things change.
Yeah. I think it's interesting that although there's a lot of overlap, I think, between something like a podcast and something like a book talk or an Instagram, there's also something unique. Like I think you do a really nice job on the short videos, and
I
they're,
appreciate it.
it's creative, and there's elements where you get that opportunity to have a community and to interact with people, and in a way that you couldn't really do that. You wouldn't just pause your podcast after 5 minutes and
Right.
solicit comments. Like, I guess you could do a live podcast, which people do, which is kind of like a hybrid of the two. But
Yeah, no, it's like a different medium, and it scratches a different creative itch too, which is fun. And I feel like I've always tried to search for things that would kind of fulfill me creatively, and the podcast, I think in a lot of ways fulfills that, but then also the short form stuff kind of in tandem with it, and still just trying to figure out like where the two fit together. And I don't know if I'll ever figure that part of it out. Cause you got to play the game on social, and you got to play the game with the podcast, but also I try not to. And I like reject the idea that you have to play the game, because then it changes your approach, and I don't want to change your approach because of outside factors, but sometimes that's part of it.
what are your thoughts on the general state of kind of reading and books and fiction and fantasy? I think there's kind of two sides of the coin, right? Where on the one hand, someone might look at all the stuff that's been going on social media and Instagram books and the book talk stuff, and they might see the incredible positives, right? Like stuff like your page, educational, informative, community, encouraging people to pick up books and read them. And then I think a more cynical person might say, really, for some of this, there's a lot of like engagement farming and, counting the number of books we're reading and some of that stuff, which might turn people off. So how do you kind of do you see that at all? Like that kind of debate happening, or do you have any
Yeah, I mean,
thoughts?
there's like I think if you were to do it in terms of the content part, not the you as a person part or how you're perceived by other people, but if you want to maximize the content, you're going to be one of those people that reads like 115 books a year. But you got to make some sacrifices to read 115 books a year.
Yeah.
And you also have to read a certain type of books to read 115 books a year. And I love reading. I hate when reading controls me. Like I want to control the input. And I think sometimes it can be like that where you feel like you got to keep up with the Joneses a little bit. Like I read 2 books this month. Like that's terrible. I have no content. I have nothing to talk about because I'm reading a 700-page book about the Battle of Chancellorsville that nobody cares about. You know? Like
Yeah, no, that's actually where I'm at right now with I'm working on a series, and yeah, I just like I don't have time for the social media stuff right now. Like, it's just not gonna happen.
yeah, and I try to get creative with like content ideas to shake it up a little bit. And so I tend not to do a ton of book reviews because if I read 40 books in a year, that's a really good year.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to read 40 books this year.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Like there's I think the platforms kind of demand a certain amount of content and a certain amount of effort to do them the best way that you can. But also, in order to do them the best way that you can, you sort of have to sacrifice some things and sort of tailor make your life to fit that. And there's pros and cons, I think, all the way around.
It's like the
But
ring of power, right? So it's like
yeah,
I think you could argue there's like a inherently corrupt, and many people have made this argument, not me, not just me. There's like a corrupting natural state of the platform and just the way it works, and
yeah,
to get where you're at a certain level, some might argue you kind of have to compromise a little bit on what you think is kind of your standard or your or maybe not, I don't know.
yeah. And some people probably do, but I think there's a lot of people also that stay true to themselves and what they want to get out of it, and they use social media as a tool.
Yeah.
And some people don't, and like I've fallen into the trap of not recognizing it as a tool. I think some people let it kind of sort of consume their social life. I'm kind of the opinion that social media has evolved into kind of like a hammer or a mallet or a stapler. Social media is not your house. It's a thing you use to build other things.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
that might be a controversial take. I don't know, but I think it has its uses, but it can get really, really weird when you don't use it correctly.
Yeah, like I'll share a story here. Like I posted a clip one time, a little short. It was kind of an idea that I had that is actually in one of my podcasts, and as I was doing the research, I was like, hey, like what if I instead of just waiting, do all the research, do the podcast, then do the promotion, like what if I took this little snippet of an idea and just made a little short video out of it. And it did pretty well. And like a few weeks later, I saw a very prominent book talker like flagrantly just steal the idea of like almost word for word. I think it was literally word for word. And that kind of just got the wheel spinning where I was like, wait a second, like how much of this is these people actually reading these books and actually kind of wanting to educate and inform versus like, I'm just consuming whatever I can and trying to get as much content out as possible. And, so I don't know. I think I was a little bit skeptical since that time.
Yeah, and I know like a lot of people make a lot of money on there doing that. So it gets a little weird when you're paying bills with it and you want to keep paying bills. And you know, everybody understands that, but also there's there's an unwritten code of conduct that some people ascribe to and others don't.
Yeah.
And Book Talk, I think, is generally really good about this compared to a lot of other communities out there, that there is an unwritten and sometimes like written down, set in stone code of conduct. And most people adhere to it. You sometimes see people that don't. And, it is what it is.
Yeah, no, and my code of conduct is, hey, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt, for a one-time thing.
You just happened to write this video that I did the same thing.
It's possible that two people came up with the same idea independently. Like, that's possible. But, yeah, is what it is.
Yeah.
as we wrap up, I think that's the...
Yeah, I mean, that's all I've got.
Yeah.
This is so much fun, man.
All right, man. Well, I'm going to take off. Yeah. This was awesome. Appreciate you.
Yeah, man. Have a great evening.
All right. You too, dude.
See ya.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe on Patreon for bonus episodes and other perks. You can also join the Patreon for free to get a monthly recommendations email and a sneak peek at what's up next. You can support in other ways, of course, by leaving a rating or review in your podcast app, by following on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, etc., by sharing with a friend, or simply by continuing to listen. You can also sign up for the email newsletter that I've been working on. Links to all of this stuff are in the show notes. Any comments or suggestions you can send to reflectinghistory@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. As always, that's it for now.